"Don't drink that water." The desperate cry from a child echoed through the mansion's grand dining room. What happened next would change everyone's lives forever, exposing secrets buried beneath years of privilege and power. The courtroom fell into stunned silence as the truth finally emerged from the most unexpected witness. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The federal courthouse in Sacramento stood like a stone sentinel against the cloudless California sky. Inside, the air conditioning hummed beneath the weight of anticipation as dozens of spectators, reporters, and legal teams filed into Courtroom 3. The hydroless pure water trial had dominated local headlines for weeks, but today promised something different: the testimony of Chandler Reeve himself. Nico Torres sat in the back row, his 13-year-old frame dwarfed by the imposing wooden benches. His mother, Marisol Torres, perched beside him, her courthouse janitor uniform freshly pressed despite the early hour she'd risen to prepare it. She hadn't planned to bring her son, but the school's unexpected closure for teacher training had left her no choice. "Remember what I told you," Marisol whispered, her fingers nervously smoothing her dark hair. "Stay quiet and don't draw attention." Nico nodded, but his eyes were already scanning the courtroom with the methodical precision that made him exceptional in science class. He observed how the morning light filtered through the high windows, how the court reporter's fingers hovered over her stenotype machine, and how the attorneys arranged their documents with practiced efficiency. The room hushed as Judge Antonia Delgado entered. Her presence commanded immediate respect, her gavel striking once to bring the proceedings to order. "The court calls Chandler Reeve," she announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. The CEO strode forward with practiced confidence. Tall and impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than what Marisol earned in a month, he carried himself with the assurance of someone unaccustomed to being questioned. As he took his seat at the witness stand, a court officer placed a glass pitcher of water before him. Something about the pitcher caught Nico's attention. Unlike the plastic bottles typically provided to witnesses, this was crystal-clear glass, filled with what appeared to be hydroless water. The young boy leaned forward slightly, noticing how the television cameras zoomed in on the pitcher, an obvious product placement for the company still claiming its water was perfectly safe. Chandler began his testimony with rehearsed sincerity, occasionally glancing at the pitcher. When he finally reached for it, something flashed in Nico's mind. The late-night experiments he'd conducted with water samples his mother had brought home from discarded evidence. The strange reaction he'd observed, the acrid taste that had burned his tongue when he'd tested a drop. The CEO's manicured fingers wrapped around the handle, lifting the pitcher toward his glass. In that moment, every chemistry lesson, every observation, every instinct in Nico's body converged into a single, horrifying realization. His heart hammered against his ribs as Chandler tilted the pitcher. Nico's eyes widened, his body tensing like a spring about to release. "Don't drink that water!" The words tore from Nico Torres's throat with such force that his small body lurched forward in his seat. The courtroom, previously hushed in anticipation of CEO Chandler Reeve's testimony, froze in collective shock. Chandler's manicured fingers, which had been confidently reaching for the glass pitcher, halted midair. The powerful executive's face transformed in an instant, color draining away, leaving behind a ghostly pallor that betrayed something beyond simple surprise. His hand trembled visibly as he withdrew it from the water, eyes darting between the pitcher and the boy. "Order! Order in my court!" Judge Antonia Delgado's voice boomed across the room, her gavel striking 3 sharp blows that echoed through the stunned silence. The federal judge's authoritative presence commanded attention, but even she couldn't completely mask her bewilderment. Marisol Torres grabbed her son's arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. "Nico, what are you doing?" she whispered fiercely, mortification written across her features. The janitor's eyes flicked nervously toward her employers and the important people whose attention now focused entirely on her family. Whispers erupted throughout the gallery like wildfire. Reporters leaned forward in their seats, smartphones discreetly capturing the moment. Court officers moved toward the Torres family, uncertainty evident in their measured steps. "Young man," Judge Delgado addressed Nico directly, her tone softening slightly. "This is a federal proceeding. You cannot disrupt—" "The water," Nico interrupted, his voice quieter now but no less urgent. "Something's wrong with it. I can see it." His trembling finger pointed toward the pitcher where, visible only to the most observant eye, a faint discoloration swirled beneath the surface. Chandler Reeve had recovered enough to affect indignation. "This is preposterous," the CEO declared, straightening his expensive tie. "This boy is clearly confused. Can we please continue with the proceedings?" Yet something in his demeanor had changed. The executive's confidence had cracked, revealing a nervous energy that hadn't been present moments before. His attorney leaned in, whispering urgently in his ear. Court security approached Nico, but the boy remained resolute despite his obvious fear. His shoulders shook, but his eyes stayed fixed on the picture, unwavering in his conviction. In that suspended moment, power dynamics shifted imperceptibly. The smallest voice in the room had somehow become the loudest, and the mighty CEO of Hydrellus Pure Water couldn't quite meet anyone's gaze. The trial of the year had veered dramatically off script, and no one, from the judge to the journalists to the corporate legal team, knew exactly what would happen next. The courtroom fell into chaos after Nico Torres's outburst. Murmurs rippled through the gallery as attorneys exchanged bewildered glances. Court officers in crisp uniforms moved swiftly toward the back rows where the boy sat beside his mother. Nico shrank into Marisol's side, his thin shoulders trembling beneath her protective arm. "Order! I will have order in this court!" Judge Antonia Delgado's voice cut through the commotion, her gavel striking with authority. The seasoned judge's eyes narrowed as she scanned the room, finally settling on the source of the disruption. "Young man, this is a federal proceeding, not a playground." Marisol Torres felt her face burn with embarrassment. As a courthouse janitor, she had always taught her son to be invisible during her shifts when he occasionally had to accompany her. Now every eye in the room, attorneys, journalists, even the powerful CEO himself, stared at them with expressions ranging from irritation to curiosity. "I apologize profoundly, Your Honor," Marisol whispered, her voice barely audible. She clutched Nico's shoulder tightly. "My son meant no disrespect. He doesn't understand the seriousness of these proceedings." But Nico understood more than anyone realized. His gaze remained fixed on the glass pitcher, his mind racing with calculations and chemical reactions he'd observed in his late-night experiments. The adults around him saw only a disruptive child, but inside his head whirled the certainty of scientific observation. "Please control your child, ma'am, or you'll both be removed," one officer warned, his badge glinting under the harsh courtroom lights. Judge Delgado studied the boy with unexpected intensity. Something in his expression, the unwavering certainty, the absence of typical childhood defiance, gave her pause. For a fleeting moment their eyes met across the crowded room, and an unspoken connection formed between the federal judge and the janitor's son. "Let's proceed," she finally announced, turning back to the witness stand where Chandler Reeve had visibly composed himself. "Mr. Reeve, you may continue your testimony." Nico felt his mother's desperate whisper against his ear. "Please, mijo, stay quiet now. We cannot afford trouble." The boy nodded obediently, but his eyes never left the picture. The system had already categorized him, just the troublesome child of the cleaning lady, not worth listening to. Yet as the proceedings resumed and the adults returned to their important business, Nico remained vigilant. The silent battle had only just begun between a boy who had glimpsed a dangerous truth and a world determined not to hear him. The courtroom settled back into its rhythm after Nico's outburst, but nothing felt normal anymore. Judge Antonia Delgado's stern voice commanded order as the trial of Hydrellus Pure Water resumed. Chandler Reeve had composed himself, though his fingers still trembled slightly as he testified about water safety protocols that supposedly made his company's product the purest in America. Nico Torres couldn't focus on the proceedings. His mind raced with questions about what he'd seen. The strange cloudiness in the picture, the way the CEO had hesitated before reaching for it. While other spectators hung on every word of testimony, the 12-year-old's eyes kept drifting to the evidence table where bottles of Hydrellus water sat in neat rows, tagged and labeled. After court adjourned for the day, Nico lingered in the back of the gallery while his mother, Marisol, began her evening cleaning routine. The courthouse emptied quickly, leaving behind the usual debris of justice. Crumpled tissues, abandoned notepads, and stacks of photocopied documents deemed unimportant enough to leave behind. "Mijo, please don't touch anything," Marisol whispered as she pushed her cleaning cart past him. Her eyes darted nervously toward the security cameras. "We can't have any more trouble." But as she moved through the courtroom, the janitor discreetly slid several discarded evidence summaries toward her son. Their silent arrangement had developed over weeks, Marisol providing access to information while maintaining plausible deniability. Hunched over in a corner seat, Nico spread the papers across his lap. His fingers traced distribution codes, manufacturing dates, and complaint records. Something caught his eye, a pattern hidden in plain sight. Every contaminated bottle, every reported illness, connected back to the same distribution facility in North Sacramento. The young student pulled his worn-out science notebook from his backpack, its cover decorated with hand-drawn molecular structures. He began jotting notes, creating a crude map of distribution routes and affected neighborhoods. 5 minutes, Nico, his mother called softly while mopping near the judge's bench. He nodded, but his pencil moved faster. The pattern was undeniable. Something was happening at that specific facility. Something nobody had noticed because they weren't looking for connections. They were looking for isolated incidents. Marisol finished her section and wheeled her cart closer. Time to go. Nico carefully tucked the notebook into his backpack, his mind racing with possibilities. The quiet son of a courthouse janitor had stumbled onto something significant, a pattern the expensive lawyers and expert witnesses had somehow missed. As they walked toward the bus stop, the weight of his discovery pressed against his back through the thin fabric of his backpack. He was determined to find the truth, even if no one believed a kid like him could possibly understand what was happening. The kitchen light cast a blue-white glow across the linoleum countertop of the Torres' modest apartment. Nico Torres hunched over his makeshift laboratory, a collection of beakers, test tubes, and pipettes salvaged from last semester's science fair project. The clock on the microwave blinked 2:15 in the morning, but sleep was the furthest thing from his mind. Just one more test, he whispered to himself, carefully measuring drops of indicator solution into a sample of hydroless water. His mother had risked her job to smuggle these bottles out of the courthouse disposal bins, wrapping them in cleaning rags and hiding them in her supply cart. The young scientist recorded each reaction meticulously in his worn notebook, the pages already filled with observations, chemical formulas, and hastily drawn diagrams. 3 different samples from 3 different bottles all showed the same alarming results: abnormal pH levels and strange reactions to basic indicators that store-bought water never produced. Curiosity overwhelmed caution as Nico lifted one of the samples to his lips. The water hit his tongue with an unexpected grittiness, followed by a sharp, acrid taste that made him gag. He spat immediately into the sink, rinsing his mouth repeatedly with tap water, but the metallic aftertaste lingered like a warning. "That's not right," he muttered, scribbling furiously. "Definitely not right." From the hallway came the soft creak of floorboards. Marisol appeared in the doorway, her eyes heavy with exhaustion after her late shift at the courthouse. "Mijo, it's so late," she said, tightening the belt of her robe. "You have school tomorrow." The boy glanced up, guilt flashing across his face. "I know, Mom. I'm almost done." His mother crossed the kitchen, surveying the chemistry equipment with a mixture of pride and concern. She rested her hand on his shoulder, noticing the row of hydroless bottles lined up like evidence. "Be careful," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "If anyone finds out I took these." Nico nodded solemnly. "Nobody will know. I promise." After his mother returned to bed, he continued working, comparing his findings to textbook standards. Everything pointed to contamination, serious contamination that couldn't be accidental. The implications made his stomach tighten. If he was right, thousands of people were drinking tainted water, including the people in that courtroom. The young student carefully packed away his equipment before sunrise, hiding his notebook beneath his mattress. He knew what he'd discovered could change everything. For the trial, for Hydrolus, for his community. But it could also cost his mother her livelihood, their apartment, their stability. For now, he would keep his findings secret, but the bitter taste of that water remained, a constant reminder of the truth he couldn't ignore for long. Marisol Torres found Nico hunched over his makeshift laboratory at 2 a.m, the kitchen table littered with water samples, and his science notebook open to pages of scribbled observations. The harsh glow of their apartment's fluorescent light cast shadows across his determined face. "Mijo, you need to stop this," she whispered, her voice tight with worry. "If anyone finds out what we're doing with these bottles—" Nico looked up, dark circles under his eyes. "Mom, I can't." "You saw what happened in court. That water isn't safe." Marisol sank into the chair beside him, her courthouse janitor uniform still on from her evening shift. Her hands, rough from years of cleaning chemicals, trembled slightly as she reached for one of the sample bottles. "We could both get in serious trouble," she said. "I could lose my job. And then what? We can barely make rent as it is." She gestured around their modest apartment, where the walls were thin enough to hear their neighbor's television through them. Nico closed his notebook. "But what if more people get sick? What if Chandler gets away with this?" The weight of his words hung between them. Marisol understood better than most what it meant to stand up against powerful men like the Hydralis CEO. She'd spent her life cleaning up after people who never bothered to learn her name. "Sometimes justice isn't for people like us to deliver," she said softly. Yet even as the words left her mouth, Marisol remembered her own father's voice. "Dignidad no tiene precio." Dignity has no price. The values she'd carried from Mexico to Sacramento had shaped her entire life. Familia, above all, the dignity of honest work, and justice when it mattered most. The next evening, Nico found 3 new water bottles tucked inside his backpack. His mother had left no note, but the message was clear. The courthouse janitor had taken a tremendous risk, quietly collecting discarded evidence that would have otherwise been destroyed. That night, when Marisol returned from work, Nico was waiting with a cup of her favorite chamomile tea. "Be careful," she told him, accepting the warm mug. "Whatever you're doing, be smarter than they expect." She didn't tell him about the whispers she'd heard while emptying trash bins near the judge's chambers, or how she'd positioned herself to overhear discussions between Chandler's attorneys. She didn't mention the courthouse security guard who had looked the other way when she slipped the bottles into her cleaning cart. Instead, she simply watched her son return to his notes, her heart torn between maternal fear and fierce pride. In his determination, she saw echoes of her own father and the unbreakable spirit that had carried their family across borders and through hardships most would never understand. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom as Clara Wynne strode confidently through the heavy oak doors. The environmental scientist had vanished from public view 6 months ago, right after resigning from her prestigious position at Hydralis Pure Water. Her sudden reappearance sent reporters scrambling for their phones and caused Chandler Reeve to visibly stiffen in his expensive suit. Clara approached the bench with purpose, her weathered leather briefcase clutched tightly against her chest. The document she presented to Judge Antonia Delgado was promptly sealed, but not before whispers of deposition and cover-up circulated through the gallery. The scientist's face remained composed, though the dark circles under her eyes betrayed months of sleepless nights. From his seat beside Marisol, Nico Torres stared in disbelief. The woman now commanding the attention of the entire courthouse had once spent Wednesday afternoons guiding him through water filtration experiments during an after-school science program. Clara had been patient and encouraging, never dismissing his questions no matter how basic they seemed. She had shown him how to test water quality using simple household items, knowledge that now felt prophetic. "The court will review this deposition immediately," Judge Delgado announced, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "We'll reconvene tomorrow morning." As the crowd dispersed, Clara's eyes swept across the room and locked with Nico's. Recognition flickered across her face. The quiet boy from the outreach program was now at the center of a national scandal. She offered him a subtle nod before security escorted her from the courtroom through a side entrance. "Mom, that's her," Nico whispered excitedly, tugging at Marisol's sleeve. "She knows everything about water safety. She taught me how to use pH strips." Marisol squeezed her son's hand, caution tempering her response. "Be careful, mijo. Powerful people don't like witnesses." That evening, news outlets buzzed with speculation about Clara's sealed testimony. Analysts debated what evidence the former Hydralis advisor might possess, while company spokespeople hastily arranged press conferences to discredit her as disgruntled and unreliable. But for Nico, Clara's return represented something more personal than headlines. Someone with authority, someone who understood the science, had finally stepped forward. The scientist who had once praised his curiosity was now fighting the same battle. As he carefully arranged his chemistry supplies that night, a new energy fueled his determination. Clara's courage had rekindled his hope that the truth about Hydralis would finally come to light. Tomorrow, the real fight would begin. The courtroom had been a pressure cooker for days, but no one expected what happened next. Elaine Winters, a former quality control inspector at Hydralis, had just taken the stand. Her testimony about water testing protocols was crucial to the case against the company. As she settled into the witness chair, she reached for the Hydralis bottle provided, a seemingly innocent gesture that would change everything. "Ms. Winters, could you please state your position at Hydralis between 18 and 20? The prosecutor asked, adjusting his tie. Elaine took a long sip from the bottle. Before answering, Mid-response, her words began to slur. The courtroom watched in horror as her face contorted. Her breathing became labored, and she clutched at her throat. The bottle tumbled from her hand, water spilling across the polished wood floor as she collapsed. "We need medical assistance immediately," Judge Antonia Delgado commanded, her gavel striking with urgent authority. The gallery erupted in chaos. Screams, accusations, and the frantic shuffle of people backing away from their own hydrellus bottles. Nico Torres jumped to his feet, his earlier warning now vindicated in the most terrible way. "I told you!" he shouted, his voice barely audible above the pandemonium. Marisol grabbed her son's arm, pulling him close, as court officers rushed to clear the room. Paramedics burst through the double doors, equipment in hand. The witness lay unconscious as they worked, the cameras capturing every moment for a nation now riveted to the unfolding drama. Chandler Reeve sat frozen at the defense table, his face ashen as he watched his company's reputation disintegrate in real time. "This court is in recess until further notice," the judge announced, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "All hydrellus products in this building are to be secured as evidence immediately." In the hallway, reporters swarmed like hungry predators. Clara Wynne pushed through the crowd, her eyes finding Nico's across the sea of bodies. A silent acknowledgement passed between them. This was the turning point they had feared and needed. Outside the courthouse, people dumped bottles of water into street drains. Inside, court staff in blue latex gloves collected every hydrellus container, sealing them in evidence bags. As the ambulance wailed away with Elaine inside, a terrible reality settled over everyone present. This wasn't just about misleading labels or corporate negligence anymore. What they had witnessed was potential poisoning in plain sight. The water wasn't just unsafe, it was actively dangerous. Judge Delgado retreated to her chambers, remembering her brother's mysterious illness after drinking the same brand. The connection she had tried to dismiss now seemed undeniable. This case had just become personal for everyone involved. Nico Torres knew he needed an ally with resources beyond his homemade chemistry kit. After 3 nights of research, he found Eliza Brenner, a local journalist whose environmental justice exposés had twice won regional awards. With trembling fingers, he composed an email from the public library computer, attaching photos of his notebook findings. "I didn't expect a response so quickly," Nico whispered to his mother as they walked home that evening. Marisol squeezed his shoulder, her eyes darting nervously to check if anyone was listening. They met Eliza at a small cafe 2 blocks from the courthouse. The journalist arrived with a leather messenger bag and a no-nonsense expression that softened when she saw how young Nico actually was. "So you're the courthouse whistleblower," she said, sliding into the booth. "Tell me everything about these water samples." Nico explained his observations, his voice growing stronger, as Eliza took detailed notes without interruption. When he finished, she nodded thoughtfully. "I have contacts at Sacramento State's Environmental Science Lab. If what you're saying is true, we need professional analysis." 2 days later, they stood in a university laboratory as a technician ran tests on the water samples Marisol had carefully collected from courthouse disposal bins. The results appeared on a computer screen, complex chemical signatures that made Eliza's eyebrows rise. "This compound," the technician pointed, "doesn't appear in standard bottled water. It's synthetic and shouldn't be there." Nico felt vindication wash over him. "That's what I've been trying to tell everyone." Eliza photographed the results and requested official documentation. "This could be the smoking gun against hydrellus," she said, her professional demeanor momentarily giving way to excitement. That evening, they reviewed everything at the Torres' apartment. Spread across their small kitchen table were test results, Nico's notes, and Eliza's research into previous hydrellus investigations. "The compound appears consistently in samples from their Sacramento distribution center," Eliza explained, connecting dots that had eluded authorities. "But it's absent in samples from other regions." "So it's not the source water," Nico concluded. "It's something happening during local processing." Marisol brought them cups of chamomile tea, listening intently while pretending to fold laundry nearby. Her worried expression couldn't mask the pride in her eyes. "I'm running the story tomorrow," Eliza announced. "This evidence deserves public attention before the trial continues." As she packed her notes, the journalist paused. "You know this could change everything, right? Chandler Reeve and his entire company will come after us." Nico nodded, suddenly feeling the weight of what they'd discovered. "But people are getting sick. Someone has to tell the truth." Chandler Reeve paced the marble floors of his downtown office, tie loosened and jacket discarded. The Hydralis CEO's normally composed demeanor had crumbled after the witness collapse in court. His phone hadn't stopped ringing. Board members, investors, and public relations specialists all demanding answers he couldn't provide. "Get me those settlement papers now!" he barked at his legal team. The strategy was clear: silence the plaintiffs before more damage could be done. By morning, Chandler had authorized unprecedented settlement offers, 7-figure sums, with ironclad confidentiality clauses. His representatives fanned out across Sacramento, knocking on doors with briefcases full of documents and promises. "Your family has suffered enough," they told plaintiffs. "Why drag this through a public spectacle when you could have financial security today?" Many families, struggling with medical bills and lost wages, found the offers nearly impossible to refuse. Meanwhile, the executive scheduled a private meeting with Judge Antonia Delgado. They met in her chambers, where Chandler arrived with his most charming smile and a thick motion to dismiss. "Your Honor," he began smoothly, "this case has become a circus. That Torres boy's outburst, the unfortunate incident with our witness, it's creating mass hysteria without scientific basis." He slid the motion across her desk. "For the good of the community, we should resolve this quietly." Judge Delgado studied the document, her expression unreadable. The jurist remembered her brother's violent illness last year after drinking what doctors eventually traced to Hydralis water. The company had denied any connection then, offering a small goodwill payment that barely covered his hospital stay. "Mr. Reeve," she finally said, "this court doesn't exist to protect Hydralis from public scrutiny." She pushed the motion back toward him. "Motion denied." Chandler's facade cracked. "Judge Delgado, be reasonable. The economic impact of this trial is not my concern," she interrupted. "My concern is justice and public safety." The businessman's voice dropped to a whisper. "There are people who would appreciate your cooperation, people who influence judicial appointments." Antonia's eyes narrowed. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Reeve?" "Of course not. Just highlighting mutual interests." She stood, signaling the end of their meeting. "File your motion officially if you wish. The court will respond accordingly." Later that evening, the judge received 3 calls from political donors and a state senator, all suggesting the case might be overblown. She ignored them all, instead reviewing the evidence file once more, paying special attention to the notes from Nico Torres and the journalist's preliminary findings. "Corporate power doesn't dictate justice in my courtroom," she whispered to herself, thinking of her brother, of Marisol cleaning these very floors, and of a boy brave enough to shout the truth. Clara Wynne and Nico Torres huddled in the back corner of a small cafe 3 blocks from the courthouse. The environmental scientist had chosen this location carefully, far enough from prying eyes but close enough to slip back before anyone noticed their absence. "I've been collecting these for months," Clara whispered, sliding a manila folder across the table. Her hands trembled slightly as Nico opened it, revealing meticulously organized documents with highlighted sections and handwritten notes in the margins. Nico's eyes widened as he scanned the pages. "These are the original safety logs," he said, his voice barely audible over the cafe's ambient noise. The boy compared them with his own worn science notebook, where he'd recorded all his findings from homemade experiments. "They altered them," Clara explained, pointing to discrepancies between dates and test results. "See this filtration process? It's called high-pressure mineral extraction. It was banned in 3 states after preliminary studies showed it produced trace toxins when combined with certain plastics." The teenager nodded, connecting dots that had eluded even seasoned investigators. "That's why the pH levels were so inconsistent in my tests. It's not just contamination, it's deliberate cost-cutting." Clara looked at him with newfound respect. What had begun as a mentorship during a school outreach program had evolved into a partnership of equals. "Chandler knew," she said, pulling out an internal memo with the CEO's signature. "He authorized continued use even after preliminary reports showed problems." "But why would they risk it?" Nico asked, flipping through more documents. The scientist's expression hardened. "Distribution patterns," she replied, unfolding a map with colored markings. "Notice anything?" Nico studied it carefully, his finger tracing distribution routes. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The contaminated batches. They're all going to lower-income areas. "Including your neighborhood," Clara confirmed. "And mine. The wealthy districts get bottles from different facilities with updated filtration systems." They sat in stunned silence, the weight of this discovery settling between them. This wasn't just negligence. It was targeted. The communities least equipped to fight back were bearing the brunt of Hydralis's dangerous shortcuts. "My mom drinks this water," Nico whispered, his voice catching. "Everyone on our street does." Clara placed her hand over his. "That's why we need to finish this, Nico. Not just for the trial, but for everyone they've put at risk." The boy nodded, determination replacing shock in his eyes. He carefully photographed each document with his smartphone, ensuring they had backups. What had begun with a desperate shout in a courtroom was evolving into something much bigger, a fight for environmental justice that neither of them could have anticipated. 6 months earlier, Nico Torres had stood nervously beside his homemade science fair display, watching as judges passed by with barely a glance. His project, The Secret Language of pH, How Acids and Bases Change Our World, featured a series of glass jars containing different liquids whose colors transformed when mixed with lemon juice. While other students showcased flashy robotics or elaborate solar systems, his modest experiment earned only a participation ribbon. "Maybe next year, mijo," Marisol had said, squeezing his shoulder as they packed up the display. The janitor's son had nodded, disappointed but undeterred. Now, sitting cross-legged on his bedroom floor, surrounded by notebooks and water samples, Nico realized that same failed project had given him the knowledge to recognize what was happening in the courtroom. The memory washed over him in vivid detail, how he'd spent weeks testing household liquids, documenting color changes, and learning that seemingly clear substances could hide dangerous secrets revealed only through chemical reactions. "The lemon juice," he whispered to himself, flipping through dog-eared pages of his science notebook. His fingers traced the careful notations he'd made about how citric acid could reveal certain compounds through subtle color shifts. The same reaction he'd noticed when Chandler Reeves' hand had reached for that pitcher, the faint pinkish tinge at the bottom that no one else had seen. Clara Wynne had been the only teacher who'd taken time with his project, explaining how scientists used indicators to test for contaminants. "Sometimes the most important discoveries look like nothing special to the untrained eye," she had told him. The young student pulled out his phone and texted Clara. "It was the science fair project. That's how I knew." Her response came quickly. "The lemon juice experiment? Nico, you're brilliant." For the first time since the courtroom chaos began, a smile spread across his face. What the adults had dismissed as a child's hobby, what his classmates had mocked as boring, had become the foundation for uncovering corporate corruption that threatened thousands. Marisol entered the room with a sandwich, finding her son surrounded by papers and bottles. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "That sometimes small things matter," he replied, closing his notebook. "The science that everyone ignored might save people." The janitor's son stood a little taller that evening, his confidence growing with each connection he made between his childhood curiosity and the very real danger he'd identified. What had begun as simple tinkering with household chemicals had prepared him to challenge one of the most powerful companies in America, and perhaps even win. Marisol Torres tucked a strand of hair behind her ear as she pushed her cleaning cart down the courthouse corridor. 3 weeks had passed since her son's outburst, and the Hydralis trial had become the center of their lives. What began as a mother's fear for her job had transformed into something far more powerful. "Did you find anything?" whispered Eduardo, another member of the cleaning staff, as they crossed paths near the evidence room. Marisol nodded slightly, slipping a folded document from her uniform pocket. The janitor tucked it away with practiced discretion. What the lawyers and executives failed to notice was that the courthouse's invisible workforce had eyes and ears everywhere. That evening, in the staff break room, 5 custodial workers gathered around a small table. Marisol spread out photocopies of shipping manifests she'd rescued from a recycling bin outside the prosecutor's office. Carmen, who cleaned the administrative wing, contributed photographs of emails left carelessly on a printer. "My cousin works at the Hydralis Distribution Center," said Javier, the night supervisor. "He says the temperature logs were altered for months. The trucks would overheat, but they never reported it." The janitor pointed to dates that matched perfectly with Nico and Clara's timeline of contamination. What these workers lacked in legal expertise, they made up for in access and determination. Their community had suffered most from the tainted water, their children, parents, and neighbors. Each night, Marisol would bring home carefully gathered scraps of evidence, which Nico and Clara Wynne would analyze and organize. The environmental scientist marveled at how these overlooked workers had created such an effective intelligence network. "They don't even see us," Carmen said one night, her voice a mixture of resignation and pride. "We're just the people who empty their trash." "That's their mistake," Marisol replied, straightening her shoulders. Judge Delgado, sharp-eyed and observant, began to notice the pattern of information emerging in court, details that seemed to materialize from nowhere. One afternoon, she caught Marisol's eye as the janitor replaced a water pitcher. The judge's slight nod contained a world of understanding. The courthouse workers moved like shadows through the halls of power, their actions guided by the values that sustained their community: familia, dignidad, and justicia. They passed notes in Spanish, used coded phrases about cleaning supplies, and created a system for marking important documents with nearly invisible dots of cleaning solution. By the fourth week of trial, Clara had assembled a comprehensive map of Hydrelis's misconduct, built largely from evidence that would have been shredded, recycled, or buried in filing cabinets, if not for the quiet alliance that formed in the margins of the justice system. The journalist's car pulled up to a nondescript building on the outskirts of Sacramento. Nico Torres stared through the window at what appeared to be an ordinary commercial facility, its bland exterior giving no hint of the critical testing that supposedly happened inside. "Hydrelis approved testing facility," the journalist read from her notes. "According to public records, this is where all their water safety certifications come from." Inside, the journalist flashed her press credentials, claiming to be working on a feature about water safety protocols. While she distracted the receptionist, Nico slipped down a hallway, his eyes widening at what he found. The laboratory equipment looked ancient. Machines from at least a decade ago lined the walls, their calibration stickers long expired. "These are Harmon Mills spectrometers," Nico whispered when they regrouped outside. "My science teacher said they were discontinued years ago because they couldn't detect microplastic compounds below certain thresholds." The journalist nodded, typing rapidly into her smartphone. "And look what I found." She showed Nico public records revealing that the lab's director, Martin Reeve, shared the same last name as Chandler. "They're related?" Nico asked, his voice rising with disbelief. "Cousins," she confirmed. "I cross-referenced property records and family obituaries. Martin Reeve is Chandler's first cousin. He was appointed lab director 3 years ago, right when Hydrelis started using the new filtration process Clara mentioned." That evening, hunched over his worn notebook at the kitchen table of their modest apartment, Nico pieced together the implications. Marisol watched her son with a mixture of pride and fear as he connected the dots. "Mom, every single safety report from the past 3 years came through this lab," he explained. "If they were using outdated equipment that couldn't detect these compounds, then all their safety claims are lies," Marisol finished, placing a protective hand on her son's shoulder. The journalist called later that night with more damning evidence. The lab had been cited twice by state regulators for procedural violations, but had remained Hydrelis's exclusive testing partner. More troubling still, she'd discovered that 3 other independent labs had offered their services to Hydrelis at competitive rates, only to be rejected without explanation. "It's a complete sham," the journalist told Nico. "They created their own testing facility, staffed it with family, and used outdated equipment that couldn't possibly detect what was actually in the water." As Nico hung up, he realized they now had proof of something far worse than negligence. This was deliberate deception, a calculated effort to hide dangerous contamination from the public and the courts. The web of corruption reached deeper than anyone had imagined. Judge Antonia Delgado sat alone in her chambers long after the courthouse had emptied. The manila folder before her, a case from 3 years ago, lay open, its pages illuminated by her desk lamp. She traced her finger over the name Hydrelis that appeared repeatedly throughout the documents. "I should have seen it then," she whispered to herself, remembering how she'd ruled in favor of the water company in that earlier lawsuit. The plaintiff had been a small environmental group claiming contamination in a local reservoir, but the evidence hadn't been conclusive enough. At least that's what she'd believed at the time. The judge pulled out her phone and scrolled through old text messages from her brother Miguel. 3 years ago, he'd complained of strange symptoms after switching to Hydrelis as his regular bottled water. The doctors had dismissed it as a virus, but now Antonia wondered if there had been more to it. She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her judicial robe, even though she wasn't wearing it. Throughout her 15-year career on the bench, she had prided herself on impartiality. But this case was different. The image of young Nico Torres standing up in her courtroom, his voice breaking through protocol, had shaken. Something loose inside her. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Her clerk handed her a sealed envelope. Another motion from Chandler Reeve's legal team requesting dismissal. this time citing undue influence from external parties. Antonia placed it atop the growing stack of similar requests. The pressure was mounting daily. That morning a state senator had called, speaking in carefully coded language about economic considerations and the importance of business confidence. 2 corporate sponsors of her last judicial conference had withdrawn their support. She returned to the old case file, comparing water test results from then with the new evidence emerging now. The patterns were unmistakable. Had she been more thorough 3 years ago, how many people might have been spared? The phone rang again, her third call that evening from a number she didn't recognize. She let it go to voicemail, suspecting another thinly veiled threat or plea from someone connected to Hydralease. Antonia stood and walked to her window, looking out at the Sacramento skyline. In the reflection, she saw not just a federal judge, but a woman whose own family had suffered. The system she served had failed once before. She wouldn't let it happen again. With newfound resolve, she returned to her desk and began drafting orders for expanded discovery and additional expert testimony. The pressure from politicians and corporate interests would only intensify, but her commitment to justice had never been stronger. "Let them come," she murmured, signing her name with a firm hand. This time, the truth would have its day in court. The hushed courtroom felt different this time, as Nico Torres approached the witness stand. Gone were the suspicious glances and dismissive whispers that had followed his outburst weeks earlier. Instead, a respectful silence fell over the federal courthouse in Sacramento as the 13-year-old son of a janitor placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Judge Antonia Delgado leaned forward slightly, her usual stern expression softened with something resembling admiration. "Please state your name for the record," she instructed. "Nicolas Torres," he replied, his voice steadier than he'd expected. Across the room, Marisol watched her son with tears glistening in her eyes, her hands clasped tightly together in silent prayer. The prosecuting attorney approached with a gentleness rarely seen in the high-stakes trial. "Nico, can you explain to the court how you first suspected something was wrong with the Hydralease water?" The young student took a deep breath. 3 weeks ago he would have stammered through his answer, but today, surrounded by the evidence he'd helped uncover, confidence filled his voice. "It was the reaction I saw in my science experiments," he explained, gesturing to his worn notebook now entered as evidence. "The same cloudy reaction happened when I tested the courthouse samples. The water contained microplastics that shouldn't be there." As Nico detailed his findings, even Chandler Reeve couldn't maintain his practiced corporate composure. The CEO shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact with the boy whose kitchen table chemistry had unraveled years of corporate deception. "And what made you shout that warning in this very courtroom?" the attorney continued. Nico pointed toward the glass pitcher that had been preserved as evidence. "The water in that pitcher had the same cloudiness I'd seen in my tests. I knew if Mr. Reeve drank it, it would prove it was safe when it wasn't." From her seat in the gallery, Clara Wynne nodded almost imperceptibly. Her former student had connected the dots that seasoned scientists had missed, or been paid to ignore. The cross-examination came next, with Hydralease's attorney attempting to discredit the testimony of a middle school student. But for each technical question thrown his way, Nico responded with clear, unshakable explanations that left even the judge impressed. "The contamination isn't random," he stated firmly. "It follows a pattern tied to specific distribution routes, mostly to neighborhoods like mine." As his testimony concluded, Nico stepped down from the stand, no longer the invisible kid who cleaned classrooms after school, or the son of the woman who emptied courthouse trash bins. He walked back to his seat transformed, a young man whose courage and curiosity had given voice to an entire community that powerful men like Chandler had long chosen not to hear. Clara Wynne stood before the packed courtroom, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The former Hydralease environmental scientist had spent the night preparing for this moment, the culmination of months hiding evidence in safety deposit boxes and sleeping in different motels. "I hereby confirm that Hydralease Pure Water executives, including Chandler Reeve, were fully aware of contamination issues for over 12 months, she stated, her words causing an audible gasp among the spectators. The scientist placed a thick folder of internal memos on the evidence table, each document bearing timestamps and executive signatures. Judge Antonia Delgado leaned forward, her expression grave as Clara revealed the most damning detail. The water pitcher placed before Mr. Reeve yesterday was deliberately planted by Hydralease's legal team, a test of truth they never expected to fail. Chandler's face contorted with rage from the defense table. The CEO slammed his fist down, prompting his attorneys to physically restrain him. "You signed a confidentiality agreement," he shouted, his polished corporate veneer finally cracking. "Some things matter more than contracts," Clara replied, making eye contact with Nico Torres in the gallery. The boy who had started it all gave her a slight nod of solidarity. By afternoon, Clara's professional reputation was under systematic attack. Hydralis representatives released statements questioning her mental stability and professional competence. Former colleagues were pressured to disavow her work. Her pension, 23 years in the making, was suspended pending administrative review. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed around her. "Do you regret coming forward?" one shouted. Clara paused, considering the mortgage she could no longer pay and the career that had effectively ended that morning. "When I saw that boy, Nico, risk everything to speak up, I realized I couldn't stay silent anymore," she answered. "Some sacrifices are worth making." Back in her modest hotel room that evening, Clara watched news coverage of her testimony. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages, some supportive, others threatening. A text from Marisol Torres simply read, "Our home is your home, if you need it." The scientist who had once advised corporate boards and published in prestigious journals was now labeled a whistleblower, her name becoming synonymous with both betrayal and courage, depending on who was speaking. But as Clara watched footage of emergency water distributions beginning in affected neighborhoods, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: peace. Her career was over, but the truth was finally flowing as freely as water should. The laboratory fell silent as Nico Torres placed the final slide under the microscope. The journalist stood beside him, notepad ready, while Clara Wynne paced nervously behind them. What they discovered wasn't just chemical contamination, it was something far more insidious. "These aren't normal impurities," Nico explained, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "It's a microplastic compound I've never seen documented before." Clara leaned forward to examine the sample herself. Her years of environmental research hadn't prepared her for this. "The plastic molecules are breaking down into something new when exposed to high temperatures during transport," she confirmed, exchanging a worried glance with the boy. The journalist photographed the evidence while Nico explained how thousands of Hydralis bottles had likely been affected. The contamination pattern matched perfectly with shipments that had crossed through the Central Valley during last summer's record heat wave. The same bottles distributed primarily to lower-income neighborhoods like their own. "The compound becomes nearly undetectable after cooling," the young scientist continued, "which is why standard tests missed it." He reached for a small bottle from his backpack, the same mixture he'd been experimenting with at home. What happened next stunned everyone in the laboratory. Nico squeezed a drop of lemon juice into the water sample. Before their eyes, the clear liquid transformed, taking on a faint pink hue that was impossible to miss. "This was the reaction I noticed in court," he said softly. "When Judge Delgado's assistant placed lemon slices beside the pitcher, I saw a slight discoloration where the juice had splashed. That's why I shouted." Clara's hand trembled as she documented the reaction. "The citric acid acts as an indicator," she whispered. "A natural litmus test." The implications were staggering. The scientist calculated that hundreds of thousands of people across multiple states had potentially consumed the compound. Early toxicology reports suggested it could accumulate in tissue over time, potentially causing neurological symptoms that might not appear for years. "This is why Chandler was so desperate to settle," the journalist noted, already drafting headlines in his mind. "The company knew." Nico nodded, remembering the CEO's face when he'd shouted that warning. It wasn't just surprise, it was recognition. Later that evening, as the laboratory tests were officially documented, Nico sat quietly beside his mother in their apartment. Marisol squeezed her son's hand, pride overwhelming her previous fears. "You saved people," she said simply. The boy who had once been invisible had uncovered a truth that would change everything, all because he noticed what others had missed in a simple glass of water. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Antonia Delgado adjusted her glasses, her expression grave as she prepared to deliver the verdict that would change everything. After weeks of testimony, evidence, and the unexpected courage of a young boy, the moment of reckoning had arrived. "In the case of Sacramento Citizens versus Hydralis Pure Water," Judge Delgado began, her voice steady and resolute, "this court finds the defendant guilty of willful negligence, criminal endangerment, and corporate fraud." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the packed room. Nico Torres sat beside his mother, their hands clasped tightly together. The boy who had once been invisible now found himself at the center of a national spotlight. Across the aisle, Chandler Reeves' face had turned ashen, the CEO's confident demeanor finally crumbling under the weight of exposed truth. Hydrelus Pure Water is hereby ordered to pay $4 billion in damages to affected communities, the judge continued, with special provisions for long-term medical monitoring of all consumers. Her gaze swept the courtroom, lingering briefly on Nico. Furthermore, I am recommending federal prosecution of 3 executive officers for criminal conspiracy. Marisol squeezed her son's hand, tears streaming silently down her face. The janitor, who had risked everything by saving evidence bottles, now watched justice unfold before her eyes. Clara Wynne, seated nearby with her attorney, closed her eyes in quiet vindication. The scientist's career might be over, but her conscience was finally clear. Within hours, the ruling dominated every news channel across America. By evening, protesters had gathered outside Hydrelus headquarters, once a gleaming testament to corporate success. Security guards stood helplessly as the abandoned building was tagged with spray-painted messages, the most prominent reading "Agua no es veneno." Water is not poison. In Washington, lawmakers who had ignored similar cases for years suddenly called emergency sessions. 3 states immediately suspended all Hydrelus contracts, while the EPA announced comprehensive reviews of water safety protocols nationwide. Today marks a turning point, proclaimed the journalist who had helped Nico test the samples, when corporations can no longer silence the most vulnerable voices in our society. For the Torres family, vindication came with unexpected consequences. Job offers flooded in for Marisol, while universities reached out to Nico with scholarship opportunities. Even Judge Delgado, typically reserved, invited them to her chambers after the verdict. "You reminded me why I became a judge," she told Nico, her professional demeanor softening. "Sometimes justice needs a brave voice to point out what everyone else is afraid to see." As they left the courthouse that evening, Marisol looked at her son with newfound pride. The sacrifice and fear had been worth it. Together, they had helped change the course of history, proving that even the smallest voice could echo across an entire nation. 6 months after the trial that changed everything, the Torres' modest apartment had transformed. What was once a cramped living space now buzzed with energy every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, as neighborhood children gathered around the kitchen table turned laboratory. Nico Torres moved between eager students, demonstrating how to test water samples with the same homemade techniques that had exposed a corporate giant. "Remember," Nico told a wide-eyed girl holding a test tube, "science isn't just about fancy equipment. It's about asking questions when something doesn't look right." Marisol watched from the doorway, pride radiating from her face. No longer just a courthouse janitor, she now worked as community liaison for the newly established Sacramento Water Safety Commission, a position created in the aftermath of the Hydrelus scandal. The commission had even provided funding for their neighborhood workshop. Across town at the federal courthouse, Judge Antonia Delgado presided over the unveiling of a simple framed photograph in the main lobby. The image showed Nico standing tall beside Clara Wynne, both smiling beneath a plaque reading, "For speaking when it mattered most." The ceremony was small, but significant, a permanent reminder that justice sometimes comes from unexpected sources. Clara had declined a position with the Environmental Protection Agency to start her own independent testing laboratory. Her first clients were communities similar to the Torres' neighborhood, places historically overlooked by regulatory agencies. Chandler Reeve had resigned in disgrace. The former CEO now faced criminal charges, his reputation in tatters as Hydrelus struggled to rebuild under new leadership committed to transparency. On the 1-year anniversary of that fateful day, Nico received a letter from a small town in Michigan where residents had used his testing methods to identify contaminants in their own water supply. Similar stories emerged from Arizona, Pennsylvania, and beyond, a ripple effect of empowerment. That evening, as Nico prepared for a television interview about the citizen science movement, he paused at the kitchen sink. The sharp scent of lemon, which he now used in every demonstration, filled the air as he squeezed a wedge into a glass of water. The familiar cold steel of a water pitcher sat nearby, a deliberate reminder of where it all began. "Sometimes I still can't believe it," Marisol said, adjusting her son's collar. Nico smiled, remembering the terrified boy who had once shouted across a silent courtroom. "I learned something important, Mom," he replied. "Sometimes the smallest voice in the room can be the one that saves everyone from silence."